I'm Becky Quick of CNBC and your host of The Forum. I'll be guiding you through exclusive conversations among some of the world's global leaders. Conversations previously held behind club doors, but today we invite you in. The Economic Club of New York serves as the premier forum for nonpartisan discussion dedicated to connecting the world's brightest minds with preeminent public and private sector leaders. A nonprofit 501c3, the club is a 115-year-old platform for the conversations that help shape the future of our world. The Economic Club of New York, brightest minds, critical conversations, catalyst for innovation.
So if you ask the U.S. Trade Representative 10 years ago or 12 years ago or 15 years ago, what are you trying to do? The U.S. Trade Representative would probably say, I'm trying to conclude a trade agreement with X country or X countries. Oh, okay. Why are you trying to do that? Well, we want to have as much efficiencies as possible in global trade, and a rising tide will lift all boats, and it'll be really excellent. That was the thinking and the viewpoint. Now, if you ask me and if you ask the president, what are you trying to do? I'm not trying to do a trade agreement for a trade agreement's sake. I'm not trying to do a tariff for a tariff's sake. What we're trying to do is we're trying to reshore U.S. manufacturing. We're trying to have manufacturing increase as a share of GDP in the United States. We're trying to reshore critical sectors. We're trying to get our trade deficit down because that trade deficit reflects a lot of offshoring. We're trying to get real median household income up, ultimately. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. You hear the president talk about America first. It's not just a slogan, it's a policy. And with our trade policy, we're trying to optimize trade for the American worker and for the American working and middle class. That's what we're trying to do. And it means we have to change the terms of trade with the rest of the world. Because if you look at what happened from post-Cold War until the first Trump administration, the trade policy was essentially on autopilot and seeking efficiency at all costs, which is an incredibly valuable thing, right? I'm not dismissing the importance of that for economic growth. But the way that growth played out, it had a negative impact in some instances in certain areas of our country, certain sectors of our economy that are incredibly important. And so we're trying to fix all of that.
And I know that President Trump and yourself have talked much about fair trade, not just free trade. I know President Trump wants free trade, but he wants fair trade first. Talk a bit about the national security implications of this free trade agenda that you are pursuing. Because I know that you've mentioned national security with regard to the supply chains quite often.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when we think about the impact of our trade policy, certainly our focus is on the domestic policy aspect of it, which is jobs for our working class and middle class, et cetera. But there's a national security component to this as well. When you think about the fact that during COVID, we couldn't get certain semiconductors across the ocean. And that wasn't just because of a China thing. I mean, this was from Taiwan, right? This is an ally. This is a place where we have a lot of ties. We couldn't get chips from Taiwan due to COVID. I mean, it shows a vulnerability. Pharmaceuticals, we only make, I think, 8% of antibiotics we need here in America. A lot of our inputs for pharmaceuticals come from China or maybe India. And just putting aside geopolitical challenges, that's very challenging and not a secure place to be in. We need to be able to have these critical supply chains back here in the U.S. as much as possible, or as close to the U.S. as possible, in North America preferably.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned pharmaceuticals, that we only make 8% of antibiotics. That is a seriously low number. And the president has announced a 100% tariff on pharmaceutical products from companies not building manufacturing plants in the U.S. Many pharma companies have already had a real stake in the U.S. Others are expanding as we speak, like Eli Lilly, like Johnson & Johnson. What area of pharmaceuticals do you believe is most vulnerable to a 100% tariff on pharmaceutical products?
Well, I mean, that tariff is really focused on some of the most innovative drugs and making sure that they're produced here. And so when the president announced that proposal, he was very clear as well that it was conditional. You will pay 100% tariff if you're not building here. So we've been in conversations with the drug companies this entire time. So this is not like something new. Everyone has known that we've had this investigation ongoing. And over the course of the past several months, we've talked about the drug companies. And if you go look in the paper over the past few months, you will see the Lillys of the world and others announcing expanded investment here. And it's not, some investment always happens, but this is investment above and beyond. And part of that is due to the possibilities of tariffs. A lot of it is due to the more competitive business environment that the administration has created. But that's really what we're focused on. When you talk about generics, it's a different supply chain. Right now, we're considering the best way to deploy economic tools with respect to generics. A lot of that is coming in tariff-free right now while we give that some more focus. It's a complex supply chain. It's critically important. We have to get it right. The drug companies have actually been quite responsive. One of the things that they're very interested in order to not only build here and charge more reasonable prices here, is making sure that other countries are also paying their fair share. So that's something at USTR that we're preparing right now to initiate investigations on pricing practices for pharmaceuticals in other countries to make sure, like defense, like other things, they're also paying their fair share to defray the high costs of pharmaceutical R&D, et cetera.
And you have achieved many deals already in terms of trade, but you are right now dealing with China and about to renegotiate USMCA. So let's talk a little about those, because when you mention pharmaceuticals and you mention semiconductor chips, it gets real clear in terms of national security issues. We understand that is a national security issue. The refining of rare earth minerals happens in China. Talk to us about your meetings with the Chinese and what you're trying to achieve in terms of rare earth minerals and a trade deal there.
So remember, with rare earth minerals, they are used, for example, to make magnets. And the magnets need to go in motors for electric vehicles, motors in drones. Anything electrical with a motor has these rare earth magnets. The United States actually invented this technology. The main producers were in the United States until the 90s, when some of those businesses were sold and moved to China. And with the idea that they can produce at scale, there were environmental issues. And now, of course, we're in a position where China has sought to use those rare earth magnets as a tool of economic coercion, interestingly, not just against the United States, but against the whole world. So if, nominally, the Chinese will say, well, the president increased tariffs on us on April 2nd, therefore, we put these controls on rare earth magnets. But if you look at the trade data, they actually started reducing their exports earlier in the year, before anything even happened. And then when they put their new controls in place, it wasn't just against the US, it was against the world. And it was quite interesting after that happened. And then, I was deployed to Geneva along with the Treasury Secretary to try to find, some accommodation with the Chinese in the near term where our tariffs on them wouldn't be so high. We were at like 145%. It's pretty high. I like tariffs, but that's pretty high. And then, to get the rare earth magnets flowing again. And we did manage to have an agreement that we would both come down and they would open the valve on that. But the interesting part is in June, I went to Paris to the OECD to have G7 meetings. And remember, at this time, we had pretty high tariffs on the world, which the other countries don't like. They say we pay the tariff, but they seem to not like the tariff, so there's something there. But during those meetings, they didn't complain to me about the president's tariffs. They complained about the Chinese controls on rare earth magnets. And so I think the Chinese really overplayed their hand in doing that.
Would you like to be a part of the conversations at the Economic Club of New York? Learn more about membership, the New York City and National Fellows programs, and other opportunities for engagement in the club at www.econclubny.org.
It's interesting to me because America does have rare earth minerals, right? I mean, so it's just the refining that happens in China. How come we can't create new companies to do that refining in America? How long would that take to get something like that up and running?
Well, we're already in the process of doing that. So obviously, we used to do it, right? We invented the technology. We did it here. It became, there's permitting and regulatory issues, right? There are environmental regulations. So this is not about trade or any of that. It's about that issue. But I will say, given what the Chinese have done, we have started to reestablish those supply chains here in the U.S. This administration, through the Department of War, took a stake in investment in MP Materials. This is the Mountain Pass mine in California, which is one of our core facilities to be able to produce these materials. And so we have a stake in it because we want to make sure that the United States is in a position to never have any country have this kind of leverage against us again. We have a bunch of startups as well, one in Texas, a couple other places, that are doing this. We have, again, Defense Department, industrial-based folks scouring the country to find these startups, to make sure that they have the economic resources they need. And we're also working with our allies in the G7 and elsewhere, with Australia. I was just in Malaysia last week, and I was talking to them about how we can leverage the Malaysian capability. They have some of the largest capacity outside of China to process rare earth minerals. So we're taking an all hands on deck approach.
So is it fair to say you're walking a balance right now of trying to reshore America, trying to get the items that are most important to this nation, while also knowing that we still rely on communist China for a lot of production?
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly right. And listen, we're always going to trade with China. That's my view. Absent some kind of kinetic event or something, or a war, God forbid, we're always going to trade with China, and we want to. That's fine. But the reality is we have to find a place with China where we are both comfortable with the trade situation. Because where are we right now? Last year we had a $300 billion trade deficit with the Chinese. The Chinese surplus with the world was like $1 trillion last year. I mean, it's the largest of any country in the history of the world. It's not sustainable. They're trying to support their economy, based on doubling down on exports, right? Their whole property, market is in a terrible situation. There's not so much. They've been building out infrastructure for years and years. They've kind of, gotten the juice out of that squeeze, and so they're just doubling down on the idea. Well, we'll just keep exporting. It's no longer sustainable. And if you look around the world, you have Mexico saying they're going to raise tariffs on Chinese goods. Canada's doing it. You have the Europeans. There's talk about them launching, dozens of anti-dumping cases. You have even Southeast Asian countries who are close to China, raising barriers. So it's not even just a U.S. thing. My view for U.S.-China, what I would like to do, and I've shared this with them, is I want to get to a place where trade between the U.S. and China is more balanced, right? Because when one side has so much leverage either way, that's actually kind of a dangerous situation. Then you can overestimate your leverage, and you can, back in April when we were both at 145% and they were withholding magnets, that was an economically dangerous situation, right? And when you have such huge imbalances, it lends itself to those situations. So I want to make sure that's more balanced. And I think it should be in trade in non-sensitive goods, right? Why can't we have a situation where we manage our trade with China, and where we in the United States have things where we are super competitive. We should be able to compete there, whether that's ag or aircraft or other manufactured goods, medical devices, these kinds of things. And there are things they can send us, right? Certain consumer items, consumer goods, et cetera. Obviously controlling the whole time for national security dependencies. Like, that is a landing zone in my view. But again, it's really up to the Chinese. America has always been incredibly open to the Chinese, ever since normalization under Nixon. We've been incredibly open. We've given them wide access in terms of goods, services, capital, and everything. And it just hasn't been reciprocated. It's really been a one-way street. But if we can get to a point where it is more reciprocal, it is more balanced, that will actually be much more healthy for the relationship going forward.
Because you're trying to also balance the volume and type of item that you're trading with China, because there's a big difference between magnets and T-shirts and toys.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't want to be dependent on the Chinese for critical things. I don't think they want to be dependent on us either. But I think if we have a healthy trading relationship where we find, goods that we can trade with each other, that we're comfortable selling, comfortable buying, I think that's a confidence building step, right? And it probably takes some kind of managed trade, which nobody likes to hear, right? I'm a Republican, I'm a capitalist, I don't want to have managed trade, but guess what? Chinese, they're not capital. Well, they're capitalists with Chinese characteristics, as they would say, but it's just so different, right? When we are thinking about our economy, we're trying to make money. And in particular, we're trying to get money down to the working class and the middle class and give them jobs and have the social cohesion that comes with that. When the Chinese are thinking about their economics, they're thinking, what's the set of economics that is going to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power and with authority, right? And certainly they want to be competitive at different places, but that's their thing. So it's just we're coming from two different places entirely in our end goals for economics. So we have to find the area where the interests overlap. And it's totally transactional, and it should be transactional, and it should be transparent, and that's what we should do.
And isn't it true that in China, the companies will always answer to the CCP, and perhaps if it's important to the Chinese military, then that will always take priority.
Well, yeah, right. That's why when we say, oh, you're not buying American agricultural products, they say, well, the economic conditions aren't right, and then we'll say, well, you're sending us too much fentanyl. Can you control that? Oh, we can't control that. It's like, well, but you can control the rare earth magnets. Like, how come you can shut those off, but not the chemicals? And so yeah, yes is the answer to your question. They can control what happens in the private economy when they want to.
So the president has tried to use our leverage, and you've talked a lot about semiconductor chips. I want to get your take on the leverage that the U.S. has, because they've got all this leverage with rare earth minerals and the magnets that go into things like the U.S. military. And we've got some of the great semiconductor companies. Talk to us about the recent commentary out of China where they told their companies, don't buy American chips. What's going on with chips right now?
So I think, I had a conversation earlier today on this. I think what you're seeing are, the Chinese companies, right? The ones we were talking about who, many of them have a degree of independence, but ultimately are beholden to their government. Those companies want the chips, right? The Chinese government wants to support their own indigenous chips. Our government, we have our own conversation about what are the appropriate types of chips to send to the Chinese. So there are actually a few things going on right there. And I think internally within China, there is very much a view in the government of China, and this is based on my conversations with the other negotiators. They are very focused on promoting Huawei and the Ascend chips and their own capabilities, even to the exclusion of a possible other capability that they might have. And so it's not just U.S. China. What's the export control? It's even within China, they are not settled on how they want to deal with that. And because we don't want to be dependent on them for rare earth magnets, they really don't want to be dependent on us for chips.
So take us behind the curtain a little, because you've had these meetings with your counterparts in China. It's a completely different culture. What are those meetings like? Tell us about them.
So this is interesting, and I'll contrast it a little bit with the first term where I was involved. In the first term, I would say that we were dealing with negotiators who understood both their system as well as the U.S. or Western system of economics, and it was, I would say it was quite constructive and fairly technocratic even. And it was a constructive period. Now I would say our talks are also constructive. They're quite cordial. But for those of you who follow, Chinese foreign policy, they've had this what they call a wolf warrior ethos in foreign policy, where on the kind of their equivalent of State Department side, they're very belligerent, et cetera. I have found that some element of that ethos has leaked into the economic side, which I think is unfortunate. But I also think reflects, the priorities of Chairman Xi, right? I mean, he's very focused on having an economy that the Chinese government has a lot of control over. And I'm not even giving a value judgment on this. I'm just kind of saying the facts of how it is. And I'm very clear, with my counterparts. I'm not trying to change China. You're a sovereign country. If you're going to take these actions, you can do that. I just want you to understand we're going to take actions too. We're trying to fix our domestic problem, which is a huge trade deficit, jobs for working class. I'm trying to fix that. China's a huge part of it, but so are other countries, right? I mean, Southeast Asia, even Europe has a lot of overcapacity in autos and that kind of thing. So I'm trying to fix a domestic problem. This is not all about China, right? You might think it's all about you, but it's not. So the dynamics in the negotiating they're just a little different that time. There's a more political edge to them. The Chinese are, they're kind of feeling their oats a little bit more now than they were before. But we're working through it. We're meeting with them frequently. We try to be as respectful as possible. We're trying to feel each other out to see, the things that we think are leverage sometimes are not, and sometimes there are things we discover we have leverage we didn't know we had, and vice versa, right? I'm sure there are things where, wow, the Americans really care about this. We didn't know. But we're trying to be as respectful as possible. We're having a lot of communication, which is really positive, not just during the meetings, but intercessional at lower levels. And that's really important, because I don't want to surprise them. If I'm going to take an action against them, I don't want them to be surprised. If they're going to take an action against, I don't want to be surprised. I want to have it as choreographed as much as we can.
Do you think that the 145% tariff is going to stay long term?
Well, we right now, not to get too much in the weeds. So we were at 145 in April. And then we came to kind of an interim agreement with the Chinese where we could have trade flowing more. And so we we got rid of a lot of that, which was counter retaliation against them. And right now, our average tariff on China, all in, with tariffs from the first term, variety of other tariffs, the tariffs we have now, it's about an average of 55% tariffs on China. Depends on the product, but that's the average. On us, their average tariff is 10 plus, that kind of thing. That is the status quo. Like if you ask the president, do we have a deal with China? He would say, yeah, this is our deal. I've got 55% tariffs on it. That's the deal. So that is a good status quo. I would like to get to a position with them where we, as I was mentioning, we have areas where we can trade, and we can trade a little more freely and in a little more transparent kind of way. But for now, that's where we are.
Okay.
You've been listening to The Forum by the Economic Club of New York, a nonprofit 501c3 dedicated to connecting the world's brightest minds for critical, nonpartisan conversations. Be sure to subscribe now to be alerted to future new episodes. Would you like to be a part of the conversation at the Economic Club of New York? Learn more about membership, the New York City and National Fellows programs, and other opportunities for engagement in the club at www.econclubny.org. I'm your host, Becky Quick. Thanks for listening.